Akio Morita did not set out to change Made in Japan through slogans, nationalism, or advertising campaigns. He changed it by asking a more demanding question: what if Japanese products could be the best in the world, and what would it take to prove that consistently? By building Sony, Morita turned that question into action, letting products carry the argument. Sony's rise mirrored Japan's own recovery: slow, failure-filled, and relentless. This is not just a founder story, it is the story of how Sony took over the world, and in doing so, permanently changed what Made in Japan means. A country in ruins and a reputation in question. When World War II ended in 1945, Japan did not emerge wounded, it emerged shattered. Entire cities had been burned to the ground. Neighborhoods that once held generations of families were reduced to ash and twisted metal. Railways barely functioned. Factories stood silent or destroyed. Electricity was unreliable. Food shortages were so severe that survival itself became a daily concern for millions of people. Japan's global reputation mirrored this internal collapse. During the war, its industrial efforts had been narrowly focused on military production. When peace arrived, the country had little experience producing high-quality consumer goods for international markets. What manufacturing did reappear was met with suspicion. Outside Japan, Made in Japan was shorthand for products that were cheap, fragile, and derivative. It was not an identity that inspired confidence. It was a label people tolerated, not one they sought out. Akio Morita was unusually sensitive to this dynamic because his life bridged two worlds. He was born in 1921 into a family that had run a sake brewery for 14 generations. Tradition was not abstract to him, it was personal. The brewery represented continuity, responsibility, and respect within the community. He was expected to inherit that role, to preserve what previous generations had built. But Morita's attention drifted elsewhere. From an early age, he was captivated by radios, sound, and electronics, not because they were fashionable, but because they hinted at a future shaped by ideas rather than inheritance. Choosing physics and engineering over economics was a decisive break from expectation. It redirected his life and placed him at the center of Japan's technological shortcomings. By the time the war ended, Morita had reached a conclusion that would define his life's work. Japan could not recover its dignity by copying what others already did better. Imitation would condemn the country to permanent second-tier status. If Japan was going to change how the world saw it, it would have to do so through original products. Products built with care, designed to compete on quality rather than cost. Changing Japan's reputation would require changing what Japan produced, not merely how much it produced. Two engineers and a shared ideal. War has a way of forging unlikely connections, and it was under those conditions that Morita met Masaru Ibuka. Ibuka was older, more experienced, and equally restless. They imagined a different future, one in which technology served everyday people instead of separating them. Radios that connected households to the world, devices that brought clarity, entertainment, and convenience rather than fear. In 1946, Morita and Ibuka founded Tokyo Tsushin Kogyo. They had little money, no clear roadmap, and no assurance that the market would accept anything they built. The company's earliest years did not resemble the beginnings of a future global icon. They looked uncertain, fragile, and often discouraging. The company's first attempts at creating consumer products were failures in the most concrete sense. The electric rice cooker, envisioned as a way to simplify daily life in post-war households, could not reliably do the one thing it was meant to do. Sometimes it burned the rice, other times it left it half-cooked. It solved no problem consistently enough to justify its existence. The electric heating blanket that followed proved even worse. It was unsafe, unreliable, and quickly withdrawn. Both products disappeared almost as soon as they entered the market, leaving behind losses, embarrassment, and the quiet pressure to stop experimenting. Akio Morita and Masaru Ibuka treated each failure as information. They examined why the rice cooker failed, not just technically, but practically. They asked how heat distributed, how materials behaved, and how real people used the product in real kitchens. They did the same with the heating blanket, identifying not only design flaws, but also the risks introduced when engineering ignored everyday conditions. These were not abstract lessons. They were painfully concrete, learned at a time when every mistake cost money the company could barely afford to lose. That mindset eventually intersected with an opportunity rooted not in invention but in necessity. During the war, Japanese authorities had deliberately disabled radios across the country, cutting wires so citizens could not listen to foreign broadcasts. When the war ended, millions of radios were suddenly useless, and millions of people wanted them fixed. Radios represented connection to news, to music, to a world that had been inaccessible for years. Sony began offering radio repair services, and this work became a turning point. On the surface, repair was a modest business. Beneath the surface, it was an education. Repair forced Sony to confront products not as designers imagined them, but as users experienced them. Technicians saw which components failed most often, how wear accumulated, and where small design choices created large frustrations. They listened to customers explain what annoyed them, what confused them, and what they valued most. For Morita, this period reshaped his understanding of quality. Technical brilliance meant nothing if it did not translate into satisfaction in the home. Precision mattered only insofar as it improved the user's experience. Repair work taught Sony how to see products from the outside in, rather than the inside out. This insight would later become foundational to Sony's design philosophy and its obsession with usability. The transistor and a global vision. The real inflection point in Sony's history did not arrive with a best-selling product or a sudden surge in revenue. It arrived quietly in the early 1950s when Akio Morita learned about a new invention emerging from American laboratories: the transistor. At first glance, it looked like a technical improvement, smaller than vacuum tubes, more efficient, less fragile. But to Morita, it represented something far more consequential. It was not an upgrade, it was a reset. Vacuum tubes had defined electronics for decades. They were bulky, power-hungry, generated heat, and failed often. Entire industries had been built around their limitations. The transistor, by contrast, hinted at a future where electronics could be compact, portable, and personal. Radios no longer had to sit in living rooms. Devices no longer had to be tethered to walls. Sound, information, and entertainment could move with people. Morita immediately grasped the deeper implication. Countries that mastered transistors early would not just build better products, they would define the next era of electronics. For a nation like Japan, still recovering from war and far behind the United States industrially, this was a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Japan could not outproduce the West using old tools, but with new tools, the hierarchy could be rewritten. Rather than waiting for the technology to diffuse gradually, Morita decided to pursue it directly. He traveled to the United States and entered negotiations to license transistor technology. For Sony, this was an audacious gamble. Many contemporaries viewed the decision as reckless. Why would a fragile company bet its survival on an unproven manufacturing process? Why not continue repairing radios or making incremental improvements to existing products? Morita's answer was implicit rather than explicit, because incremental progress would never change Japan's fate. While in the United States, Morita experienced something that sharpened his resolve further. He saw American cities filled with energy, confidence, and ambition. He visited Germany and observed a country rebuilding with astonishing speed and determination. Both nations were looking forward. Japan, by contrast, still felt suspended in the aftermath of defeat, but things would change soon enough, and Morita would make sure of it. Sony is born, and quality takes center stage. To pursue a truly global vision, Morita understood that even symbols mattered. The company's original name, Tokyo Tsushin Kogyo, was accurate but unwieldy, and it anchored the firm firmly inside Japan. Morita wanted a name that could cross borders effortlessly, one that could be spoken in any language without friction or confusion. He combined sones, the Latin word for sound, with sunny, a term associated with youth and vitality. The result, Sony, was short, modern, and free of cultural weight. It did not sound Japanese or Western. It sounded global. That was intentional. With the name in place, Sony turned its full attention to transistor radios. The ambition was clear: make radios small enough to integrate into everyday life, not just homes. But execution was brutal. Early manufacturing yields were terrible. Most transistors were defective. Costs spiraled. The company took out loans simply to stay alive. At multiple points, Sony stood on the brink of collapse, but persistence eventually paid off. In 1955, Sony released the TR-55 transistor radio. It worked, but Morita pushed further. The follow-up, the TR-63, was marketed as the world's first pocket-sized transistor radio. While the claim required some creative tailoring of shirt pockets, the underlying achievement was real. Radios had become personal. For the first time, people could carry sound with them. News, music, and voices untethered from fixed locations. Sony radios spread across Japan and then across the world. With them traveled a new signal. Japanese products could be inventive, desirable, and well-made. Made in Japan no longer automatically implied compromise. It began to suggest ingenuity. Reinventing television and redefining excellence. Flush with momentum from radios, Sony turned toward a far larger challenge: television. By the early 1960s, color television existed, but it disappointed almost everyone. Sets were expensive, images were dim, colors were inaccurate, and reliability was poor. Black and white televisions remained dominant because they simply worked better. Most companies attempted to improve existing designs incrementally. Sony chose a more dangerous path. Morita and Masaru Ibuka decided to rebuild color television technology from the ground up. This was not refinement, it was reinvention. The decision nearly destroyed the company. Early production runs were riddled with defects. Sony sold televisions at a loss just to move inventory. Internally, the projects looked catastrophic. Engineers struggled, finances strained, critics questioned Morita's judgment. But Morita persisted because the goal was not to compete, it was to redefine the standard. He believed that if Sony could create a color television that was clearly superior to black and white in quality and value, consumers would not need persuasion. They would choose it instinctively. Years of experimentation followed. Materials were tested, manufacturing processes refined, image quality obsessed over. Finally, Sony introduced Trinitron, a television with brighter images, sharper resolution, and unmatched reliability. Trinitron did not merely succeed, it dominated. Over the following decades, Sony sold hundreds of millions of units worldwide. The product won international awards and became synonymous with excellence. More importantly, it sent a powerful signal to the global market. Japanese engineering could define benchmarks rather than chase them. The Walkman and cultural transformation. If Trinitron redefined how the world experienced television, the Walkman fundamentally altered how people related to music, and more quietly, how they moved through everyday life. On the surface, the idea seemed almost trivial. A cassette player stripped of its recording function, paired with lightweight headphones. To many inside and outside Sony, it looked like a step backward. Why remove features? Why sell a device that could only play music when portable tape recorders already existed? Context mattered. In the late 1970s, headphones were not symbols of cool or individuality. They were associated with hearing aids, radio technicians, or airline passengers. Music, when portable at all, was shared, played aloud in homes, cars, or public spaces. The prevailing assumption was that technology should do more. More functions, more buttons, more capability. By that logic, the Walkman made no sense. But Akio Morita was not designing for logic alone. He was designing for feeling. Through years of observing consumers, Morita had developed a conviction that people did not merely want better machines, they wanted better experiences. He noticed that people traveling, walking, or commuting often wanted companionship without conversation, stimulation without obligation. Music, he believed, could become intimate rather than communal. The Walkman emerged from that insight. By removing the recording function, Sony made the device smaller, lighter, and simpler. By pairing it with headphones, Morita transformed music into a private space. The Walkman allowed individuals to carry their own emotional environment with them wherever they went. Internally, the skepticism was intense. Sales teams doubted consumers would buy a device that could not record. Engineers questioned the usefulness of a product that broke convention. Even senior executives were unsure, but Morita insisted. He believed so strongly in the idea that he was willing to stake his reputation on it. When the Walkman launched in 1979, its impact was immediate and unexpected. People began jogging with headphones, commuting with music, and reclaiming moments of solitude in crowded cities. The product did not just sell, it spread socially. Seeing someone wearing headphones sparked curiosity. Curiosity turned into imitation. Within a short time, the Walkman was no longer just a device, it was a cultural signal. The numbers were staggering. Over its lifetime, the Walkman sold hundreds of millions of units across multiple generations. Most importantly, the Walkman demonstrated that Sony was no longer merely responding to consumer demand. It was shaping it. The company was not asking what people already wanted. It was revealing what they had not yet articulated. That ability to anticipate latent desires and give them form became one of Sony's defining strengths. Global scale and a new identity for Japan. As Sony expanded beyond hardware into music, film, and later video games, Morita's original mission remained constant. He believed Japan's future did not lie in exporting cheap goods, but in exporting ideas, experiences, and standards. The acquisition of record labels like CBS Records allowed Sony to integrate content with technology, creating a vertically controlled ecosystem. The development of the compact disc in the late 1970s and early 1980s, in partnership with Philips, revolutionized music consumption. It offered unmatched sound quality, durability, and convenience, and positioned Sony not just as a manufacturer, but as a standard-bearer for the global music industry. Similarly, the PlayStation, launched in 1994, was a bold move into interactive entertainment, combining hardware, software, and developer partnerships to define an entirely new category of gaming that eventually made Sony a dominant force in the global market. By the late 20th century, Japanese products were no longer associated with imitation or disposability. They were admired for precision, reliability, and innovation. Made in Japan had become a mark of trust. Today, Sony stands as a global powerhouse that extends far beyond the hardware roots of Morita's vision. The company generates around 12.9 trillion yen, approximately $86 billion in annual revenue, employs over 113,000 people worldwide, and holds a market capitalization near $150 billion. Its PlayStation brand remains a dominant force in gaming, with the PS5 selling more than 84 million units and PlayStation Plus boasting 119 million active subscribers, while Sony Music and Sony Pictures continue to expand their influence in entertainment. Though not every venture succeeds, the company consistently turns innovation into profit, with entertainment now accounting for over 60% of its earnings. Proof that Morita's philosophy of exporting ideas, experiences, and standards endures more than half a century later. Sony's rise mirrored Japan's own post-war recovery, slow, painful, and filled with failure. But isn't that how real transformation usually happens? Through Sony, Akio Morita showed that identity is not fixed. It can be reshaped through work, vision, and consistency. And by creating products people loved and trusted, he changed what made in Japan meant forever. So the question he leaves behind is simple but uncomfortable. Are reputations won by arguments, or built patiently, one decision, one product, and one standard at a time? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Until next time.